Hi, my name's Louise Merrill. I'm a senior solicitor in the employment team at Clark's Legal. This is the second podcast in our TUPE in 10 podcast series. Our first podcast provided an introduction to the two types of relevant transfer covered by TUPE, namely a business transfer and a service provision change. If you're wanting a general introduction on what a service provision change is, make sure you listen to the first podcast in the TUPE in 10 series, available on our Clark's Legal and Employment Buddy websites. This podcast will be focusing on two essential elements of a service provision change, namely the requirement to have the same client pre and post transfer and the requirement for activities to remain fundamentally the same pre and post transfer. So let's turn to the first of these, the requirement that the client on whose behalf the activities are being provided remain the same pre and post transfer. It's only the provider of the activities who will change. In many cases, this will be relatively straightforward. However, the position becomes more complex when subcontractors have been engaged. Here's a couple of cases to highlight this point. In Horizon Security Services versus Nadiz, the London Borough of Waltham Forest contracted out management of one of its business centres to a company called Workspace, who let out the offices to their own clients. Workspace subcontracted out security services to a company called PCS, who employed a security guard, Mr. Nadiz. Mr. Nadiz engaged with PCS on a day-to-day basis, patrolled the building and surrounding area and assisted Workspace's clients. Waltham Forest then decided to end the current arrangement with Workspace and engaged a company called Horizon to provide security services directly to it. The question therefore arose, was there a change in client? Initially, the tribunal found that there was no change in the client, as it was at all times Waltham Forest. It was the owner of the building and ultimately benefited from the service. However, on appeal, the Employment Appeal Tribunal, which we'll refer to as the EAT, overturned this judgment. It held that the tribunal had reached its conclusion based on an inference that the building owner was the client. However, this was not a finding of fact. The EAT said that on the facts there was a change of client, as pre-transfer PCS's client was clearly Workspace, and post-transfer the only client was Waltham Forest. In reaching this conclusion, the EAT highlighted that PCS's contract was with Workspace, and there was no evidence to suggest that there was any direct relationship between PCS and Waltham Forest. Workspace let out offices to its own clients, and during working hours Mr. Nadiz would direct these clients around on behalf of Workspace. Mr. Nadiz patrolled the area on the instruction of Workspace, and it couldn't be inferred that Waltham Forest was the client purely because it owned the property. You must look at the facts and not simply adopt a purposive approach. Then came the case of Jinx versus London Borough of Havering. The facts of this case are very similar to that of Horizon. The council owned a site which had an ice rink and a car park. It hired Saturn to manage the site, and Saturn subcontracted out part of this management to Regal. Mr. Jinx worked for Regal. The council decided to take the management back in-house, and Mr. Jinx argued that he should transfer under TUPE. In this case, as is common in claims involving TUPE, there was a preliminary hearing called to determine whether TUPE applied. At this hearing, the tribunal ruled that TUPE did not apply, as it said the Horizon case made it clear that the client is the person who the contract is with, and here that person had changed from Saturn to the council. On appeal to the EAT, the case was sent back to the tribunal to be revisited. The EAT felt that the tribunal had taken an impermissible shortcut by treating the client of a subcontractor as only ever being the contractor to whom it was contractually bound. It highlighted that a subcontractor may actually have more than one client. What these cases demonstrate is that whether the client is the same will be a question of fact for the tribunal, and that on the facts it is possible for a subcontractor to have more than one client. Who the contractual relationship is with and what the contract says are very important factors, but they're not the only ones to consider. Now turning to the second of the requirements we're looking at today, whether the activities being carried out remain fundamentally the same before and after the transfer. This is a question of fact for the tribunal, so the most helpful way to examine the legal text is to explore some of the cases that have ruled on this point. Let's begin with OCS Group UK Limited versus Jones and another. In this case, OCS had a contract to provide catering services to a BMW car plant. It provided a centrally located restaurant and deli bar facility. A range of hot and cold meals were provided, including English and continental breakfasts and soups. OCS's catering staff spent a great deal of time in the preparation of the hot meals. MIS took over the catering contract, but this was for a substantially reduced meal service, selling pre-prepared sandwiches and salads. There was no requirement for hot food. OCS argued that the activities were the provision of food, and so they'd remained the same pre and post transfer. The tribunal and later the EAT held that the activities were actually materially different. The catering operation had changed from the provision of a full canteen service where the catering staff were chefs to staff becoming more like sales assistants in a kiosk. Another case on this point is Johnson Controls versus Campbell and others. In this case, Johnson Controls Limited provided a taxi administration service. This was performed by one employee, Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell spent 80% of his time on this work, and this included taking instructions on taxi bookings from the client, booking taxis, advising on timings for journeys, combining jobs and pickups to ensure efficiency, dealing with booking inquiries and carrying out checks on suppliers and arranging security passes. Subsequently, the client decided its own staff could book the taxis directly and terminated the contract with Johnson Controls, and Mr. Campbell argued that he should transfer. The question arose, were the activities fundamentally the same post-transfer? The EAT decided they were not. It said that assessing activities involves a holistic assessment. It's not simply a matter of enumerating tasks and identifying whether the majority of those tasks transfer over. The service provided by Mr. Campbell was a central and coordinated service which included, for example, combining jobs for efficiency, and this did not transfer. However, the judge went on to say that he wasn't giving a green light for tribunals to always reach this conclusion. It said only that in this particular case and on its particular facts, the judge was entitled to find that there was no service provision change. And the final case I wanted to run through was the QLog Limited case. In this case, McCarthy were contracted by Ribble to deliver Ribble's products to destinations in the UK. McCarthy employed drivers, a transport manager and 4 shunters to carry out the services. The contract was terminated and Ribble entered a new contract with QLog. The agreement with QLog said that Ribble was wanting to transfer the services to it. QLog, however, did not employ drivers and so didn't undertake the transport work itself. Instead, it subcontracted this out. QLog conceded that the shunters and the transport manager transferred to it, but refused to accept any drivers on the basis it wasn't carrying out the transport services itself. And the question that arose here was whether a change in the way services are carried out could mean that activities are not fundamentally the same. The tribunal and the EAT agreed that the activities remained fundamentally the same, even though the activities were being carried out in a very different way. The wording of the agreement was important here as it demonstrated that the intention was for the activities to transfer. Further, under this agreement, QLog accepted the risk for delivery of the goods despite not providing the service itself. It had accepted responsibility for the entire service, regardless of the fact it had subcontracted part of this out. Now, it's difficult to draw any guiding principles from the cases when they're so fact-specific, but they do suggest that activities will be defined in a pragmatic and common-sense way and will involve a holistic assessment focused on the substance of the activities rather than the mode of operation. And whilst minor differences will be ignored, activities must not be defined so broadly that they lose their meaning. At the end of the day, businesses should always remember that the tribunals will be minded to act in a way compliant with the underlying purpose of TUPE, which is to safeguard employees' contracts and rights. This brings us to the end of this podcast. I hope you found it helpful. The next podcast in the series will be focusing on some of the other requirements for service provision changes, including whether there's been an organised grouping, so make sure you watch out for that one.